My parents were characters in every sense of the word my entire life. Ever since I knew them as people in my life, I knew they were extraordinary people. And I mean that by they were unusual and they were not like anybody else's parents. They were troubled in their way, and there is a lot of that in the book about my mom who was a hoarder, among other things. My dad was kind of a schemer, always almost a con man. I won't quite put that label on him, but they were doing some kind of wild and really unusual things. So I knew that, and I knew that they were worth writing about from a very young age. In terms of like how I got to this moment about writing about them. So they died in 2013 and 2015. And, that was at this point a long time ago. That was a decade plus ago. As time went on, for me, I found it almost like harder and harder to pinpoint and to talk about who my parents were. And one reason for that is they simply, stretch the truth all the time, right? So there was always like this, did that happen? Was that a tall tale that came out of my dad's mouth, or was that something that really happened in our childhood? One example is like, uh, I remember that in 1983, my dad came home. We lived in the New York City suburbs, basically on Long Island. He came home and said, "Oh, I bought an oil well in Texas, and I was in a bar in Greenwich Village, and I, got excited, and we're going to now be extremely wealthy from this investment that I've made." And that he got rid of it like a year later. So I remembered that, but that barely sounds true, right? So, as someone with a journalism background, it occurred to me that, I could find out, and that would be the driving sort of question and motivation in the book is like, who were my parents really? Did my dad buy an oil well in Texas in 1983 when we lived in New York? Um, and he did, I found out. But there are, 100 stories like that I remembered or thought were true, things that my brother and I felt but didn't know. And so that was this beautiful way for me to explore our past together. And that's sort of how I came to it. And really, I'm so glad that I did it, not just about it, for me, it's not just about publishing it, it was about doing it and about having all in one place, who my parents were, really. We did not have really close or almost any real connections to other family outside of our house. So it was my mom and dad, and then me and my brother, who's about 4.5 years younger than me. We really were kind of our own little rogue unit. So I don't have too many other family ties to either side of my parents. They were kind of estranged various ways. Um, and so I really was on my own. My brother is the most amazing ally for my book ever. So he's around, but there really aren't other people that shared this experience because both my parents are gone. So I was so fortunate that one of the towns we lived in was this really small town that had a daily newspaper. And speaking of journalism, I don't know if you remember this era, but in the 80s, when we lived in this small town, they must have had people just on every beat possible. I found things like when my little brother was 4 and was in the hospital for asthma, there was a little feature on that in the daily paper because it was a small town. And so every little thing was reported. And in that newspaper and many other newspapers in all the towns we lived in, I was really able to see some of the kind of quotidian things in my parents' lives that happened to be reported. And, my dad was doing some kind of daring things here and there. And so his life was reported on in various ways. And I was able to corroborate that with media. And then I also looked at letters, photos, stuff that I have in my garage. My brother being in the hospital was one thing. My mom at one point had some sort of um, event for her classmates in 1969 in this high school. They reported on the fact that my mom hosted people. My mother also, I think this was a big deal. She lived in this small town in Indiana and she graduated high school in 69. And what an astoundingly bold move this was. I can't even believe that she did this, but she decided to go to fashion design school and she went to Pratt in New York, Pratt Institute. So for a really innocent small town person, and this is like so many decades before you would Google Pratt and see what it looks like and who goes there and whatever. She got in based on her designs, just really interested in clothing and fashion her whole life. And she moved to New York. Well, that absolutely made the news and in this small town. So I was able to chronicle, she did that. She didn't really last in school. She did get a semester, or maybe it was a summer in Paris as part of her fashion studies. That was in the paper. And then she later left school and started working at an insurance office in New York City in about 1970, 71. And, that too was in the paper. And so this was for me, it was like, what a gift to be able to see who was my mother when she was 20 or 21. And it turns out that that job she had in the insurance office was in a new building called the World Trade Center that so she was there like when it opened, she was working as a typist in an insurance office. So I'm grateful that all those things exist. And even with like the incredible amount of information we have now with the internet and more, I still wonder if we have if you can find those kind of details about people who lived in a different time than my parents did. But I'm glad I had it. We moved to this very small town in about 1986. At that time, unusually, my dad was just doing really well. It's the mid 80s. They'd been essentially poor and struggling just for years, right? And when we moved, he was doing well. When maybe 6 months later, 8 months later, he wasn't doing well, but we'd really overextended ourselves with this move to this massive house. So my dad started to try things, and he was always trying things. And one of the things that he tried in this era was selling motivational cassette tapes. I don't know if you're familiar with like a mid-level marketing scheme or those kinds of you would call it a pyramid scheme maybe in those days, but he really got sucked into this. And so he decided that a pathway out of our money troubles for him was to sell cassette tapes that would help people better their lives. And so there were ones on dieting, one's on fixing your marriage, one's on, how to be a better salesperson. So he got into selling these tapes. And so he would have these seminars at the local hotel, conference room. He'd rent the conference room and then try to sell these tapes. It was, in retrospect, such a such a sad thing and something that you would look at now as being really kind of misguided and unfortunate. But gosh, I was able to see the full scope of, what my dad was doing in 1987, 88 in his business life. He was quoted, it's invaluable. But in a lot of ways, my parents kind of always saw themselves as wealthy, and we lived that way even when we couldn't afford to live that way. So I think a funny image that I have of my childhood is around 1989. We had been living in this house that we could not afford. It was almost 7,000 square feet, huge house in rural Indiana that they bought, when they thought things were going to go well. And they didn't go well. The house was in disrepair. My mom's hoarding issue was, I think, worse than ever. And she tried to fill that house. I feel like it was so much space, but we had so much stuff and we couldn't afford it. They tried to sell it. It didn't work out. My dad, after he had tried to sell the motivational cassette tapes, after he had tried to be a realtor and 100 other things, decided that he would fulfill his lifelong desire to become a Lutheran pastor. And so to do that, we had to move to a town north of there called Fort Wayne, Indiana, which had a Lutheran seminary. So we just packed up. We just packed up what we could from our 7,000 square foot mansion. And I could think we had a truck and we had our car, which was an extremely ostentatious dark navy Lincoln Town Car from probably 86, just like as long as you can imagine a car could ever be. Looked limo-esque or hearse-esque maybe. And we packed up and we moved to a house that we were renting that was about 1,000 square feet. So we had a lot more stuff than room again. And, it wasn't logistically possible to sell the car or change things up. So we still had that car. And we would drive. At that point, we were eating from a food bank at the seminary. We didn't have money for a grocery store. So we were going to this food bank and we'd pull into the food bank and we have like this car out of, um, every 80s movie that you've ever seen. Just completely a great image of my childhood. We were really poor, but we kind of didn't look it sometimes.